So the IBS process is summed up in the three primary steps of observation, what does the text say? Interpretation, what does it mean? Or better said, what did it mean then to them? And then application, what should I do? So we've done some work in Philemon in both observation and interpretation. And observation involves the two substeps of identify and examine observational clues, and interpretation involves two steps that the first of which is to brainstorm questions about meaning, questions about why. We've done a lot of that with the book of Philemon as well. So now I'm going to talk with you about something that serves as a bridge between those two steps in interpretation. Sometimes, and if you have experience with the IBS method in the past, or if you come across someone else talking about it at some point in the future, you may hear them talk about this as the bridge between observation and interpretation. And so they recommend that you do this is called the BRI by some people, basic required information. Um, they talk about it as the bridge between observation and interpretation, so that before you do any interpretive work, you would do this BRI work. I personally prefer to do the BRI work after we've asked questions uh, about questions of meaning, as well as questions why or why not. In that first phase of interpretation, with as many of the observational clues as there are that we would like to work with in a particular book or passage or chapter. I believe if we do the BRI before we ask the questions, then the BRI influences too much the kinds of questions that we will ask. I prefer for the BRI to help us respond to the questions, and I don't like for it to be present when we ask the questions, because I think it unduly influences how we might ask those questions, or what questions we might ask. The BRI basically refers to what was going on then in their world. It refers to basic historical, cultural context type stuff. And so the idea is that we travel into the past to learn all we can about the original audience and the context that that audience found itself in. So as I've been doing in some videos, I'm going to give you some information. I do encourage you to write it down, and that way you'll have it in your notes for any other time that you want to do some IBS work, either with me and doing another book in the future, or with someone else, or on your own, however you like to do it. But this is good information to have. So one of the first categories that we do related to BRI is we consider the author and the audience. And so we ask these kinds of questions. Who wrote the book? To or for whom was it written? When was it written? And where was it written? Okay, so these are some of the questions that we try to ask related to the author and the audience. And we try to do all of this first from internal evidence, meaning from the book itself or from other biblical books. And I'll talk more about that later. So just for example, Philemon, who wrote the book? Well, according to Philemon, Paul wrote the book. To or for whom was it written? Well, it was written to Philemon and Apphia and Archippus and the church that met at Philemon's house. In a sense, it was written for Philemon, Apphia, Archippus, and the church that met at their house, and for Onesimus. Okay, when was it written? We don't know. We haven't discovered that yet. You and I, in this video series, haven't done any work with that. And where was it written? We haven't done any work with that. Okay. And then if you're talking about context, these are some of the context questions you want to ask. So if you're doing a New Testament book, what was the historical context of the original audience? What was going on in that culture? What was the religious situation? What was the political situation? Is there anything related to the geography of the location that we might need to know that would help us understand meaning? And then if it's a New Testament work, especially if it's an epistle written to a specific church, we would want to know, well, who made up the local church, and what was taking place in the local church at this time, and what were the strengths and our weaknesses of the church, for example. What were some problems or struggles or questions they were asking? And sometimes these questions can be answered from the book itself that you're studying, and sometimes if you're relating to an epistle, some of these questions can be answered from the book of Acts, because some of the churches that Paul or Peter, etc., write to, that the New Testament writers write to, those churches were founded through one of the missionary trips that we see in the book of Acts. Sometimes, not always. So just so you know, that's where we can get some of these answers. So some of the questions to these, some of the answers to these questions can be deduced when we look at the internal evidence. That is the book itself, and then other books in the New Testament, and then possibly other books in the Old Testament, depending on what we're studying. Now, if you're doing Old Testament book, then you would, it's very similar, but instead of asking about that local church, you're going to be asking things about, well, what was God doing in the history of Israel during this time? What was the political, cultural, social, economic, religious situation during this time? And as I've said, there's there's internal evidence, and then there's also external evidence. We always want to seek internal evidence first. And we want to exhaust internal evidence before we go to external resources, okay? Always, always, always. One of the mistakes Christians make, especially in today's world, because there's so much good stuff available to us, is we go too quickly to external sources. And if we're going to do that, then why study ourselves? So we want to study ourselves. We want the Spirit to speak to us. Now, we do want to be guided, helped by other sources, because we're not doing this in a vacuum. There have been some other very wise Christians who have come before us. So we're not trying to say we're the only ones that can understand what the Spirit's wanting to say through this book or this passage or this chapter. Okay. But on the other hand, we do want to do our own Bible study. We want to commit to doing that. So internal evidence, the book we're studying, and other biblical books that might help us. External evidence can include Bible dictionaries, Bible encyclopedias, history books, books about customs and cultures, atlases, etc. There are so many resources. I want to give you my favorites. These are my favorites. These I have discovered do a pretty good job of giving information without getting into interpretation. Okay. My very favorite, if you were going to only buy one, now I like hard copy books, but that's probably something to do with my age. If you're going to get one book, either hardback or access to it online, I would recommend the InterVarsity Press Bible Background Commentary, the IVP Bible Background Commentary. It's really, really good for this kind of information. Then these others on the list, the New Bible Dictionary by the IVP, the Zondervan Encyclopedia of the Bible, that's a 5-volume set, Halley's Bible Handbook, that's especially good with the prophets, Zondervan's Pictorial Bible Dictionary, and the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary. Again, these are external resources that we only use after we've exhausted internal evidence. And we don't want to depend on these for everything we're doing. We want to get into the text and the surrounding text, okay? So that's what we mean by the BRI. Now in the next video, I'm going to give you an example of how the BRI can help us understand some of what we see in Philemon, okay? So I'll see you in just a bit.